You know, I rather like doing a really long patrol in multiple parts. It's a lot of fun, and it allows me to develop things. It allows me to occasionally even answer questions. And that is what I'm going to start off with this one, because when I put up the live, and I talked about it through the live, there were a few comments which came out afterwards, which were about various things to do with the live. Mostly, they were about the pronunciations of certain things, and it's one of the most interesting areas of history I find is some of the discussions that you can have over the pronunciations of certain words, because most words have more than one version of a pronunciation, especially as you will have different interpretations of that word as going around the various regional dialects. Now, one of the phrases that came up quite a lot was to do with Cassian. Now, Bill Bolton pointed out to me that it's pronounced like Cason, and yeah, that is one of the ways to pronounce it. That is certainly one of the probably more regular ones, but Cassian is another one of the regular ones, depending on which part of the country you come from. And that got me into thinking. It can also be pronounced Kaison, which is weird, but I've actually heard some people pronounce it. Mostly when they've been pronouncing it, they are from, to be honest, not the UK when they pronounce it that way. And there's Casson, which is with the C instead of the K, it sort of sounds like. Cassian is kind of weird because the I is actually before the S. And it sounds, when I pronounce it, like the I is after the S. Of course, it isn't. And I have no idea, but that's how my dad, my granddad on my mum's side also pronounced it, and my dad on, of course, from Liverpool and working in the ship, taught to pronounce it. So, who knows? But that's where I've picked it up. And of course, it's also like key versus koi versus, all the other things that go around. So there are various pronunciations going around. And of course, in these videos, I've already gone through the history of shown. As in, as we pronounce it, spell it these days, Shown. We have shown something to someone. Or we are showing, Showing. Whereas in all the documents in here, and these are, remember, naval documents, they are put together with very accurate spelling and grammar for the time, are spelled Shewing. Shewing. It's fun. Makes me wonder sometimes how the world's going to change in a few more years. And so, this is the Royal Navy's major selling point as a global maritime power. Infrastructure. And it's infrastructure not just in the UK. This again affects how you approach things. I always love sort of the debate you sometimes get into when people are comparing navies and they go, in certain periods, they go, well, this navy has this, which makes them better than that navy. And you go, well, yes, they do have that. But the reality is that navy has only X number of coaling stations or oil stations, so they can't support themselves unless they have those things. Whereas this navy has more of that, far more of those, and they can afford to therefore orientate, let's say, engines around speed rather than endurance. Both nations are making the right choice. Neither's better than the other. Well, let's be honest. You'd always like to have a faster warship if you can have it. But if you can't have it, then you're not making the wrong choice. It's always within the limits of technology and availability at the time. Also, you should understand that these are just the principal ports as far as the Navy is concerned around the world. They're not all their ports. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination, all their ports. They're not all the places they use. And it's, again, very different if you are looking at possibly waging war against Japan, and you're thinking, well, gonna build up the main fleet in Singapore, then push up, go through the South China Sea, probably have to retake Hong Kong. Then once I got there as the next base operations, push forward, push up and go and take wage war, take Weihai Wei, and then from there operate off the coast of Japan. Well, you have got yourself a lot closer to Japan than trying to operate from Australia. And you're doing it in slower steps. It's a different strategic situation, so it leads to a different strategic scenario, which leads to a different set of procurement decisions. Infrastructure-wise, the Royal Navy always has both an advantage and a problem. It has a lot of docks around the world, but those docks, if they're built, if you're going to upgrade them, they have to be enlarged. They have to be made bigger to take larger ships. So, you have a problem. Your infrastructure, at the same time as providing you with a lot of succor and support and allowing you to do a lot more things, simultaneously restricts you. Simultaneously, you're in a scenario where, ouch, you need to build up that dock, or you need to build your ships to fit that dock. This is another thing where the heavy cruisers come in when I'm talking about the 1920s and 1930s. And why I tend to talk around sort of the idea of actually, if they continued with armored cruisers as a sort of transforming into a heavy cruiser, as an addition to the battle cruiser and the battleship through First World War, and had them as a separate part for the treaty system, the Royal Navy would have been in a very, very good position, because it had lots of dockyards which could deal with ships of up to 21,000 tons. Its problem was dealing with ships bigger than that. It was building the yards, and it had the potential dock space available, and it was working on docks. But there are a lot less docks which can take those big ships than there are which can take the ones below 20,000 tons. For example, let's look at this table. Thank you, XSplit. Anyway, if we look at the battleships, you'll notice first class Neptune can go in Dock 15 at Portsmouth and can go in the New Lock at Portsmouth, but can't go in any others, and they can't go in any at Chatham. In fact, the largest battleship you can get in any of the dockyards in Chatham, and this is back in the UK, is Lord Nelson. It's a problem. And you can only get the Duke of Edinburgh cruisers in there. Only get the Duke of Edinburgh cruisers in that dockyard if there are certain very specific conditions met. The same with the Canopus class. Can get into Chatham's 5 and 6 if certain conditions are met. So there's basically one dock at Chatham out of 5 which can be used for ships up to the Lord Nelson class in size. In Portsmouth, there are 2 that can be used for ships which are up to Neptune in size. And one of the things you're going to learn quickly is that there are actually spaces which can take the Neptune class, but which can't take the Indefatigable class. For example, Gibraltar, there is only one dry dock that can take Indefatigable. There are 2 that can take Neptune. Malta, there is 1 that can take Indefatigable. There are 3, sort of, that can take Neptune. And again, one of those is with the Cassian moved to its outer stop. Something I'm explaining in a bit. Bermuda, no. They can sort out the Inflexibles and below, and they can sort out Bellerophon and Dreadnought under certain, well, let's put it this way, if their ships have been lightened, so should well be, again, ships at certain conditions, but they have to be lightened. But that, of course, is a floating dock. Simon's Bay can take them all. That's useful, Simon's Bay. Hong Kong can take all, but Indefatigable and Invincible it has trouble with. Yeah, the Cassian has to be in the outer stop. Rosyth can take them all, and also can take them all, but they're being built at that time. And Horbo Line can take them all, an island. Again, once it's been finished construction. At that point, Horbo Line is being worked on. And that is just some of the Royal Navy's dry docks in 1909. The Royal Navy has to produce a survey of this almost every single year when they're looking at ship types, when they've got new classes entering in. And they have to work out whether they are going to spend money, not just on the ships, but on increasing the size of their infrastructure, increasing the dock space available, increasing the size of the dry docks. This is not a new problem. It's also not a problem which has gone away. If we consider the Queen Elizabeth class, there are, and I was asked this question, and I was very lucky enough to find the wonderful Navy Lookout, and Pete Sandeman has actually produced a very good report about it. There are 5 potential docks. There are 5 dry docks which could theoretically be used for the Queen Elizabeth class, and potential for a 6th if they go through with the work at Portsmouth, which they were considering. Which would make sense, because the main trouble when you start to look at it, and the main advantage for the Royal Navy in these, is the availability. Okay? Before you even get into the length or width or depth or any of those things, there are several criteria you have to consider with dry docks. Engraving docks especially, i.e. the fixed ones, the ones built into ports. Ease of access, i.e. how deep and wide is the approaches. Availability for planned refits. And that's major ones. Those are plans. Suitability for emergency docking, i.e. will it be available if we get an accident and we need to fix something quickly? The level of dockside infrastructure, because you can have a wonderful dock and it's sitting in an expansive open area and there's not another ship maintenance facility or workspace for miles. If you look on Google Earth, you can find some docks like that around the world. I won't tell you where, but if you go hunting, you will find them. They are lovely looking engraving docks, but there's nothing anymore around them. So they might as well not be there. Current site security. Well, that's something you can increase, but here's the thing: if it's a poorly secured site and you have to bring in a squadron of Royal Marines plus the ship's crew, all armed with rifles to provide security for the ship while it's going through its work, you have got a problem. And that's before we get on to potential of air attack and all these things if it's in an unsecured, if you haven't got enough stuff around to provide air defense nowadays. And then, well, if you have to bring in those personnel and all those personnel, there has to be accommodation for them. And this is why when I talk about the Royal Navy with HMS Queen Elizabeth, and the Prince of Wales, the current areas, your list are number 1 dock Rosyth, Inchgreen Dry Dock, Belfast Dock, Seaton Port Teesside, number 5 dock Birkenhead, and the theoretical new Portsmouth facility. The theoretical Portsmouth facility has been looked at, has been studied, hasn't been built. They're all roughly long enough, although, let's be honest, Rosyth is 310 meters, and that limited the length of construction of the ships. And that, in many ways, the dock length was the biggest limitation on availability in the UK, was the biggest limitation on the dock length in the of the ship designs. Even Camulaird's big one is only 289 meters. Seaton Port in Teesside is 376. So that if you'd been assembling the ships there, you would have been able to, maybe build a bigger carrier, but then you'd have only had one dockyard, which could probably take them. Maybe Hull and Wolf. If you'd gone for 330 meters, you'd have had 2. But the trouble is, if we go through, and this is where the problems start to crop up, if we consider Rosyth, availability for planned refits, good. Inchgreen, work would be needed. That's owned by Camulaird's, of course. Belfast Dock, good availability. Seaton Port, good availability. Number 5 dock, Birkenhead, good. Portsmouth, of course, would be ideal because it would be in a completely Royal Navy owned facility, so they could dictate its schedule completely. The rest, they're either work needed or good, but they have to be fitted in between their commercial contracts. There's nothing wrong with them having commercial contracts. Remember, these are private companies. They're supposed to actually be making a profit and keeping going. Otherwise, they go bankrupt and you lose the facilities. Or the government has to spend the entire time giving them money to pay for not using the facilities, to keep them open for when they do need to use them. In which case, the government might as well own it. Suitable for emergency docking. Well, number 1 dock Rosyth is, at the moment, we can consider fair and good, because pretty much it's been focused around the carrier build for so long, that's what it's focused around. But how do we know about that long term? Inchgreen, adequate, because it's not under that much use at the moment. But Camulaird's are wanting to make that site more productive, so they are trying to get more use out of it. Belfast is dependent upon existing work. Seaton, dependent upon existing work. Birkenhead, Camulaird's again, dependent upon existing work. Portsmouth facility doesn't exist. It is a theoretical. It doesn't exist. So of the 5, there is one which is currently fair to good, and one which is adequate as it's not in use as much as the others. And the other 3 are usually being used by someone else. Dockside infrastructure support them. For Rosyth, it's extensive. They've just been assembling carriers. Inchgreen, it's poor. Unsurprisingly, it's not got much work going on. For the others, it's good because they've got work going on. Okay, security. Rosyth, high. And they've got personnel accommodation. Yes. All the rest, no personnel accommodation, and all the rest, low to medium security. Barring, of course, the theoretical ports facility, which would have extensive infrastructure and high current site security and massive facilities for personnel because they're already there, and all the security and all the other things. So, in practice, what does the Royal Navy currently have for HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales if they need a dry dock? One dock. In practice, it has Rosyth because the Portsmouth one doesn't exist, and the others would all require work. Now, honestly, on the personnel accommodation, I would say Birkenhead has a potential because there is right across the river, there is a large Royal Navy Reserve headquarters building and a facility that could well serve as the focus point for an extended, I don't know, temporary accommodation center for the Navy. It's got gym and other facilities in it, and the various secure access points you need. And of course, it's the Royal Navy. They do have boats, so they could put them across one side of the Medway and get them across the other when they needed them for the rotations. But that's not exactly ideal. That's a theoretical one. I'd say that would push, in my mind, Birkenhead Camel Laird's up to, well, of the actual built docks to probably a second position. Also, Birkenhead is quite secure. However, the actual dock we're talking about is right next to the road. So there are security issues that way. This is the problem. And these things are not easy to move. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about a graving dock. We're talking about something which will tend to have a sliding cassin. A sliding cassin is what's normally there. However, some docks are also equipped with what's called a ship cassin in the outer slot. And that is something which is put in when you're dealing with larger vessels. But when you're dealing with larger vessels like that, you then have to function in how you're going to support their hulls. Because if you look at that, you'll notice that there is a line of blocks, which is where the hull is supposed to rest down. And there is the height between the entrance and the sill at the entrance, and there is differential between the dock floor and the blocks. And usually you build up the blocks to a level higher than the sill at entrance, but still you prefer to not have the ship, if you can, resting on the sill. It's quite a complicated procedure, and graving docks matter because, believe it or not, you can't careen a modern aircraft carrier. You can't get it out of onto a beach and start slanting it from one side to the other, or even, as they did with the floating dock, do it in the middle of the ocean and just go, hello, hello. Well, not middle of the ocean, the middle of the bay. It's just not really practical with an aircraft carrier. So these matter. Now, again, and it's one of the interesting facilities, one of the things which you could do with, especially with Portsmouth, in terms of access, if you built it in Portsmouth, depending on where you put it, you could actually make it so it's able to be opened from both ends. And I would say putting it in so it could be open from both ends is probably the most sensible, because that would mean you don't have to do a very hard turn going in and going out. And having a double entrance facility, even if you can't in practice use it because it goes into a basin and you can't get it out any other way than going back through the dock, is useful, because it means you can move it out of the dock, use a dock for other things, but just move it into the basin, fit it out, check it in there, and then if you find you've got some trouble, you can move it straight back into the dock rather quickly. Whereas if it's gone out to the port side rather than the basin side of the dock, then it's probably not going to be parked anywhere near it. And this is, again, using the wonderful image provided by Pete Sandyman on his Navy Lookout site, which I really do recommend going and having a look at. I like it. It's good, and he produces interesting stuff. Anyway, this is his Portsmouth idea of where the options are. As you can see, hard turn. Hard turn to get it in. You can do it. I'm not saying you can't, but it will be hard. Whereas the far one is probably more complicated to build, because let's be honest, you would have to build temporary protections from the water at both ends and modify quite a lot of existing harbour infrastructure. But the thing is, it would be far more useful after you've built it. But anyway, this is today's issues. Now we are dealing with the Royal Navy's advantages and disadvantages in the World War I, World War II era. So meet Horbo Line, which is actually a pretty darn big loss for the Royal Navy. Okay, Ireland goes its own way in 1917, really. It's been going its own way for a while before then, but it gets going its own way really in 1917. And the thing is, the loss of Horbo Line, which is a base which is in County Cork, Ireland, so it's in Southern Ireland, just across the Irish Sea from Cornwall. It's a big loss for the Royal Navy, because in many ways this base was the fallback post for ships damaged in the Channel. You could take them to here and they'd be well out of the range of enemy action, because to get to there they'd have to go past a lot of other Royal Navy ships. The island has a strategic position in the harbour area, and it's also in quite deep water, which is useful for getting ships in and out. In 1806, the British Army moved to nearby Spike Island, and the fortifications were handed over to the Royal Navy. Well, 14 acres of land going to the Royal Navy. The remaining 8 acres went to the Board of Ordnance. The Royal Navy soon went to work. At that point, there was just, 22 acres of Ireland. The island itself now, today, is roughly 86 acres. Now, there was a few acres of unusable land, so let's be honest, it was probably, considering 22 acres of basing, it was probably about 35 to 38, depending on the so you read acres, and it's now 86 acres. All that's artificial, basically. The Royal Navy wanted a better base, and they built one. They were prepared to build an entire island to get it. One of the critical parts they build, and you can see that, is most islands are not naturally square-shaped. Yes, it's kind of like when you're checking out the borders around the world and you want to know where the British Empire's been, you find straight lines. The Royal Navy has been building islands. Oh! We have an island which is... let's be honest, it's... someone has been playing around with a rectangle and just going, we can do these things. The large basin was constructed in the 1860s, and it was completed originally with a 124 metre or 408 foot dry dock at one end, and that was extended just prior to the First World War to 180 meters, or 600 feet. It has a hospital, it has ordnance, not hospital in a converted warehouse, in a converted storehouse, all those facilities. But you can actually see that they have taken their lovely straight line and gone, you know, we need a bigger dry dock, so let's build the island out a bit more. It's just, this is the Royal Navy. Now, the interesting thing is they only build one big graving dock, but they do seem to consider expanding it. They also have a slipway for smaller vessels, motor torpedo boats, probably even destroyers at some point. They might have been considering they could use that slipway, but you know, by the time it's probably you're talking about the destroyers are too big for that. It's a useful facility in a very good point, and it's about, especially at this time, having infrastructure in depth. Having places you have available to be able to use for frontline if you're fighting the French across the channel, so quick repairs, and having places once you've tried you can take things to for longer repairs. And taking them up the Irish Sea is far, far safer than trying to take them up the North Sea. And again, why is a large navy thinking about this? Because a large navy doesn't stay large if it doesn't have maintenance facilities. I'm going to keep going on about this ad infinitum in every single one of these videos. There is no point having a large navy if you don't have the maintenance facilities to repair it and keep it operating. Because quite soon, your number of damaged ships sitting harbourside and as an effective mission kills will outweigh the number of ships you can put to sea because you cannot repair them. Docks matter. Infrastructure matters. It's not sexy, it's expensive, and no one ever looks good pouring concrete. But that is what you need to do. Chatham. Chatham is, of course, historically one of the Royal Navy's premier bases. But as we were looking at earlier when we considered this, Chatham has only one dock, number 9, which is big enough for a Lord Nelson. If we look at this map, we can see number 9. And we can all think, do you really want to try and get a Lord Nelson into that? Because your options are to bring it through the North or South Lock, depending on how brave you're feeling that day, and then through all the different Cassians between the basins, or to bring it around the river and bring it in the Cassian into number 1 basin. And actually, if you consider that, there is a factory set up there for repairing, factory, fitting out, and then them going out to sea. So there is a sort of flow between the basins of what the ships are for and what the ships are there for. It's cool, I suppose. I still prefer not to have to use it if I can. And again, this is the problem for Chatham at this point. They are going down in priority. They are going down in their capabilities. Not because they are a bad dockyard and not because the workers there are bad, but because you have to start making a choice of the infrastructure you're going to build. Now, if you think about Chatham, if you think about the layout of land, it would take a lot of money. You could conceivably put in a huge dry dock there, if you know. And we might well be talking about a different sized Royal Navy today if they had built a huge dry dock at Chatham. Because it's just enough in close enough range of London, you could have built your aircraft carriers within range of London and employed London workers. which would mean there would be, if governments tried to cancel them, those London workers would be going on strike right outside the Houses of Parliament. I'm not being cynical here. I'm just suggesting that when the striking workers are right outside Parliament, it's far more difficult to ignore them. But that would have required a lot of money and a lot of investment, and you then would have to deal with the river. So they didn't. Then we have Devonport. Devonport is one of my favourite dockyards. It's an absolutely gorgeous expanse of naval engineering and maritime engineering and infrastructure. And it's really, really worth considering when you're sort of talking about these things. It has a long history. But again, when we go back to that pesky little 1909 description, Devonport, what do we have come up? Well, it looks like 8, 9, and 10 and the Norfolk could take these ships. Eight, 9, 10, and Norfolk. So the ones between the number 5 and number 4 basin. And of course, if you use the North Lock, then your ships aren't able to really get into the basin unless they use the sliding caisson entrance for number 5 basin, which is further up the It's a fun thing to consider. Not exactly something I'd want to consider, but it's a fun thing to consider. And of course, there is a reason none of those docks feature on the list provided by Pete of Naval Navy Lookout. None of those dockyards, none of those dry docks are long enough for an aircraft carrier, and none of them are really long enough for some of the larger battleships. They can deal with the shorter battleships, the older battleships, but as battleships get bigger, get longer, well, there's a difference. HMS Neptune was 166.4 meters overall and displaced 20,000 tons in normal. She had a beam of 25.9 meters and a draft of 8.7 meters. She also had a weird arrangement of her wing turrets, but we'll leave that to one side. And super firing aft turrets. HMS Hood, who is ordered 8 years after Neptune. So she's ordered in 1916. Neptune was ordered in 1908. Hood is of course a battle cruiser, but weighs in at 47,430 tons. Is 262.3 meters long. Has a beam of 31.8 meters and a draft of 9.8 meters. In less than a decade, ships' lengths have gone up 100 meters. Or, let's be honest, this is gonna be the honest. We're talking, well, 4 feet for every 3 meters, which is 33 times 4 plus 3 for 100 meters roughly. Well, no, yeah. 10 feet for every 3 meters, so it's 330 feet, 333 3 feet. Sorry, did the math wrong. 7 feet and 3 meters. So 33 times 10. Not sure why I was adding the 4. Historian, not mathematician. But there's no way you can add in an extra 100 meters on those docks without taking over either basin number 5 or basin number 4. If you take over basin number 5, you're never going to get into those docks. And if you take over basin number 4, you're going to have trouble getting into those docks. Because you'd have to go through basin number 5 and come back. You'd have to completely rebuild that yard. This is the trouble. The Royal Navy has infrastructure, but the infrastructure has been built up over hundreds of years. The first graving dock in Portsmouth is built in the time of Henry VII. It's still in use today. Well, the side of it is, I'm fairly sure the dock's been rebuilt a few times. But that's what M33 sits in, the Monitor. Then we've got Pembroke. Pembroke is a lovely place. Originally called Pater Yard. It's not been in use since 1926. And the reason it's closed down in 1926 is because the Admiralty is cash-strapped. And whilst the RAF built Pembroke Dock to house its flying boats in the 1930s and demolished many of the unnecessary buildings for their hangars and facilities, it really didn't help it for doing anything more. And when we think about it, when we think back again to the list down here, well, Pembroke doesn't even feature on this list. It doesn't even feature. Now, again, Pembroke is a place where you could have actually extended the dry docks. Probably, if you had the money and the inclination. But they didn't have the money, and so they couldn't have the inclination. You have to have the money first before you can have the inclination. So we get to Portsmouth. Of course, that is what I was showing you earlier with the basin conversion, and we can sort of look at us and go, oh, Alex, it's amazing. Yeah. It is amazing. Count off the docks and you realize that it's pretty much been the same for quite a long time. They have done some modifications. They've turned the rigging and repairing basins into one big basin. They have built in another lock. But pretty much it's still there, and I think M33 is in that one. That's the Henry VII one. Because I think Victory's in the one along from that. You can still see a lot of those original facilities. You can also see this dock has gone. It's gone. It's no longer there. It's been filled up. And you've still got these two dry docks, but they're quite small. What can they look after? Probably smaller vessels, river class and other MCMVs. For getting ships into it, anything bigger is going to be pretty difficult. So yeah, there is an obvious thing of making your dry dock there, but if you put your dry dock there for the Queen Elizabeth, it's going to be take up too much space of access to the others. This is again a problem. The Royal Navy has this dockyard sitting around in the 1920s. They have HMS Hood going around the world in the 1920s. And she is, of course, 263 meters long. And if I just check, HMS Queen Elizabeth is 280 meters long. Read through Hood and her history. You won't find her being reconstructed in Portsmouth. She's given a brief refit in Portsmouth, but that's a very brief refit. And that's not in a new lock. In fact, the only pictures and records I found on the Hood Association website and searching around of her in a full dry dock where she's actually taken out of the water show Hood in the floating dry dock at Malta. There are dry docks in the UK which could have taken her. Belfast, all these things. The ones, again, we talked about earlier with the Queen Elizabeth class, they could take a 200. They could all take a 260-meter ship, like they can take a 280-meter ship. But not Portsmouth. So, Rosyth. Well, Rosyth, of course, can. Rosyth is being built up at this point, and Rosyth is an interesting place because whilst it was formerly Royal Navy Rosyth, it's been many years civilianized, and now, of course, is the construction facility for the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. Again, we have a lovely picture of them in that dockyard. And you can see this is, of course, a newer facility than on this 1909 picture. They added a new dry dock. But you can also see there isn't much space there. It's certainly not much at the end or much back at the entrance. Either at the bow or the stern, there isn't that much space. There's never going to be. You're never going to have dry docks which are massively outranking the ship in them. If you do, you've spent a lot of money on a dry dock for nothing. But they have got the space. And this also comes with a massive crane. Another thing you have to think about when putting together these facilities. It's not just a case of building the graving yard. It's a case of, do you have the cranes? Do you have the other support infrastructure for it? So again, you can build a wonderful graving dock, but if you then don't put in the cranes and the other facilities for it, you don't have anything. Rosyth is lucky. There is various naval construction and industry not that far away the Royal Navy can draw from to grow itself. But it's not particularly easy site to grow. And then we have, of course, the River Medway. Well, what do we have here? We have Sheerness Dock. And Sheerness is an interesting one because, again, if we go back to this diagram. This lovely table. Well, Rosyth is on there. Simon's Bay in South Africa is on there. Malta is on there. Gibraltar is on there. Sheerness is not. And you can see why. Because A, they're the older style of dry docks, definitely. But B, and this is probably most important, all of them are quite difficult to access. If you think about it, those three, the far end, you have to come in and turn the ship. It's the same with this, on this end. You come in, you have to turn, line up. It's not something you want to do with a large capital ship, which is very expensive, if you can avoid it. Because, believe it or not, ships bumping into concrete walls is not good for ships. Stone walls, not good for ships. Again, when we go back to Portsmouth, New Lock and the space we were talking about earlier makes a lot of sense because you can bring the ship in and maneuver it about. And also, if you've got both ends open, the effect will make it far more stable when you're bringing in the ship, because the energy and movement of the water it's displacing can spread out over a larger area. You don't get quite so much of an impact of the water being forced out of the narrow spaces you're going in, which isn't much of a problem. No, it's not something that we usually worry about too much, but it means you can go in at a slightly higher speed and be slightly quicker in operations. And then we get to Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a good place for the Royal Navy. Gibraltar has lots of interesting facilities, and of course, when I was talking earlier, their docks were large enough for Neptune class. And they had been large enough for a while. They were used to having a significant Royal Navy presence, and the Royal Navy was very happy to build things there. And to just show how important the dock was, its largest major extension plan was in 1937, when the danger of war considered with Italy, and again, this is something I often point out, the Royal Navy in 1930s wasn't sure if it was going to be war with Japan, Italy, or Germany, or or a combination of two, or in worst case, all three. The reality was that number 1 and number 2 docks were extended to accommodate new aircraft carriers and the new larger battleships. They'd already been built, in the case of number 1 dock, to hold 100,000 tons of water. Number 2 dock could take 60,000 tons when she was built, and number 3 dock could take 50,000 tons when built. Number 4 dock, of course, is even tinier. And these docks were critical. Now, these actually still retain and are commercial assets. They might have been owned by Camel Airs and Navy and various other people at points, but they are commercial assets now. And one of the interesting things to note is that they are 272 meters long, the longest. So in other words, it's still too short to get a modern Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier in there, but was long enough to get Hood in there when they were upgraded. So the largest is 272, the shortest was 154. And the other one is slightly shorter than the longest one. So again, if we want the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carriers to maybe use Gibraltar, then we need to do some infrastructure investment. Incentivize the company to do so. But at the moment, they're not long enough. You probably need to add on at least 30 meters to be able to get it long enough for a Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier to go and dry dock in Gibraltar. Give you a little bit of space. Still going to be cramped like Rosyth, and remember that picture which came up earlier and which I will put up again. The Rosyth dry dock is 310 meters long. And that doesn't look like a lot of space at either end if you want to get at the prop shafts or you want to check the bow up properly and maybe send some things down there to look at them. So yeah, you are probably looking at more. 40 meters, 50 meters. You want space. And again, it's still a limiting factor for the Royal Navy. It's a limiting factor for the US Navy. It's a limiting factor for every Navy in the world, the infrastructure they have and they have available. And for the Royal Navy, the infrastructure around the world meant that they could support their ships around the world. That's great. But the trouble is that infrastructure either has to be invested in to grow its size, or you are capped in the size of your ships. The Royal Navy had a lot of infrastructure in the 1920s which could afford to support 20,000-ton ships, i.e., what would have been heavy cruisers by that point. They didn't have a lot of infrastructure which could support HMS Hood. Which was a 260 meter, 47,000 ton. Let me sure I'm getting that right. Yeah. 47,000 tons in deep load ship. There's a difference. There's a limitation on where and how far you can operate her. And yes, great, she can use the floating docks. So that means if you want to be able to support her, you're going to have to move the floating docks. And moving a floating dock is possible, but not exactly easy or advised on open oceans unless you have no other choice. They're all they've been doing it for years. They didn't want to. So there you go. There's the first part of Royal Navy infrastructure. And I'll be dealing more with overseas bases next time. But yeah, Gibraltar matters. Gibraltar is important, and it gets the investment. And think about that. In 1937, Gibraltar isn't useful for a war against Germany. It just isn't. It isn't useful for a war against Japan. It isn't. It's only useful for a war against Italy. War against Germany. Does the Royal Navy expect to be fighting major fleet battles in the middle of the Atlantic? No. Maybe, especially not the size of the German fleet. They expect actions in the North Atlantic, but again, France is in the war. Norway's still neutral. They're not expecting it to be developed like it is. No one expects Norway to fall so quickly. No one expects France to fall so quickly. Gibraltar, that's all about Italy. That's all about the Mediterranean. And they invest. Because they have to. Right, what have we got coming up? Right then, on the February, tomorrow after this comes out, it's the Brummer class of the Kaiserliche Marine, which I still haven't recorded. I'm going to. It's going to be recorded well before you see it, but anyway, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to record the other parts of the series now. I've been having a chat with a friend, and if there's someone I recommend you follow if you're interested in naval infrastructure, Tim Moots on Twitter is exceptional, and that's what he's really focusing on. Very, very good on naval infrastructure. Right, what else we got coming up? We've got Lord Charles of Beresford's birthday this week. It's going to be fun. Take care, everyone.